Good evening, everyone. To those of you that are just signing on, we're just going to give it a few minutes so people can join, and we'll be starting shortly. Good evening, and welcome to Keeping It Alive, the fourth and final panel of the series Let's Talk Plans. This webinar series is a collaboration between the ASLA-New York and the ASLA-New York Upstate chapters. My name is Annie Pausalad. I am the chair of the Education Committee of the ASLA-New York. I would like to introduce my co-moderator tonight with the ASLA-New York Upstate chapter, Molly Vendura.
Thanks, Annie. Before we start our panel tonight, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Parkitex, Victor Stanley, and Ernst Seeds for their continued support of our chapter. A little bit about our format. Each panelist will spend a few minutes sharing their insights onto designing with plants and how to maintain to ensure our design is successful. Each panelist will spend a few minutes sharing their insights into this, and following these brief introductions, we will move into a discussion amongst the panelists and encourage you to join the conversation by sending questions and insights to our panelists via the Q&A dialogue on your screens. And please note, use the Q&A box and not the chat box for your questions. For those who would like to obtain CEU credit for attending this webinar, we'll provide a link to the quiz and evaluation at the conclusion of the webinar. You must complete both the quiz and the evaluation to receive credits. This distance education program has been registered with LACES by the New York Upstate chapter of the American Society of Landscape Architects. As a registered provider with the LACES systems, credits earned on completion of this program will be reported to LACES. The learning objectives for tonight include to understand the maintenance challenges of landscapes and how to overcome them, to learn what to include in effective landscape maintenance specifications, and to understand how to effectively communicate long-term landscape needs and expectations.
Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Desiree has 10+ years of public space management work, including small-scale urban parks, large-scale public spaces, and planning. She uses careful research to identify problems and provide proactive solutions for public space design and management. Elements of her work include economic feasibility studies, need and impact analysis, landscape maintenance plans, and park optimizations. Welcome, Desiree.
Hi, thank you, Annie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me to join you guys at this panel. Here we at ETM, Molly, we go to the next slide. Here at ETM, we advocate to have the conversation regarding maintenance right from the beginning. And when I say right from the beginning, I mean, like, it should be integrated into part of the design process rather than treating it as an afterthought. We have seen a lot of projects and we have spoken to a lot of the maintenance staff who will be responsible for the projects that, you know, they are not integrated early enough into a project, and that actually causes a lot of problems. And some of the reasons why you want to have this conversation early on is that, you know, the fact is that the project is here to stay once it's done constructing. And the cost of maintenance is significantly greater than the cost of constructions. So you want to be able to protect your capital investment. I mean, this is a very important part of, you know, in the client's interests. And And aside from that, you want to be able to protect the design team's long-term vision. You know, and also having a well-maintained park means that you're ensuring the comfort of the park users, and also you create a safe space for users, and the staff will be taking care of the space. You know, just that, you know, when people go to a park and they see that it's not being maintained, it's not being taken care of, they would feel like there's no ownership to it and they are discouraged from using the space. And that will actually further encourage undesirable social activities. And so that will actually lead to quick deterioration. And here we see and then the other thing is to, once you get the conversation in early, it also helps the maintenance staff understand what needs to be done in order to maintain these landscapes. Here is actually the lawn area of Clyde Warren Park down in Dallas, Texas. This is a sand-based lawn, event lawn that is on a special structural soils. So the soils is actually a larger granular, and core aeration is not allowed in this one particular type of lawn area. So unfortunately, they have actually done some core or aeration. And so, there's a lot of kind of testing back and forth in order to, get it right. But in the end, they did have to actually do sod replacement. And that is quite a significant cost. Sod replacement is easily, anywhere between $2 to $3 at this point for replacement. And if that's something that you need to do, every couple of years, I mean, that is a very significant cost that you need to take into considerations. And next slide. And the other reason you want to talk to the staff is that, they may actually know the site better than you do, especially if you're coming from our states. And they can tell it. We have dealt with a number of projects where, with the climate changing, there are plants that will no longer work at the location, or they tend to do better, but they know the diseases that are in the city. So you want to actually have that conversation with them to see what plants actually fare best for their sites. And oops, sorry. And the other thing is, we are implementing a lot of landscapes into a lot of parks that will go beyond your typical mow and blow operations. A lot of city staff, public staff, they can do the mowing very, very well. Now, if you put in a meadow, the last thing you want to do is mow it on a weekly cycle. That is going to kill all your meadows. So, in order to actually be able to protect the landscapes and have it live up to the vision that you have, you want to have that conversation in early, help them allocate the right, staff with the right knowledge, right resources in order to actually maintain these landscapes and maintain them well to the vision that, both you and they will have in the future. I mean, particularly in these ecologically sensitive landscapes. Here in the picture is actually Memorial Park down in Houston, Texas. And here's a railroad that is kind of cutting across the park. And in that area, because, it's a rail line, so they actually put down some metals in order to allow it to serve as the public right of way as it is, but also to kind of restore the landscapes that they once had at the park. We could go next. And another reason to actually have this conversation really early on is that, you want to, let the staff know how the landscape should be replaced or replanted over time. I mean, there are two types of landscapes. There's one that is you maintain, as in, you care for the plant one by one. You might do a one-to-one replacement. And then there's also the landscape that you manage. And what it means is you actually kind of take care of it as a system, as a whole. And therefore, you might replace the similar type of planting because it does better than other. But, if that's the style or the type of maintenance that you need to do, you need to convey that idea early on. And you need to let them know that this is the type of landscape they're working with. And also on top of that, knowing how the spaces are going to maintain is going to impact on the staffing resources that you need to allocate. Does your site need a gardener, a horticulturist, a ecologist, a natural resource manager, an arborist, or who else would you need? And we're going to the next slide. And what it really comes down to is to be able to figure out what that cost is, because all of those staff that those job titles that I just mentioned, they contribute to what your annual operating cost is going to be. And the other thing is that you have to realize is that planting maintenance is very different from your other hardscapes or site furnishing maintenance. With hardscapes and also site furnishing, you can kind of expect a certain life cycles, and after 20 years, you will need to replace your bench, and you can allocate that funding toward your capital repair or improvement costs. However, when it comes to planting, it's a little different, where the cost is usually a lot more significant at the beginning. It tapers off. However, as these trees and all these planting grow, they became greater value, and these assets will actually end up costing you significantly more to, one, remove or to replace. So these are the things that you need to really consider when it comes to landscape maintenance. Okay.
Thank you, Desiree. Our next speaker, Josh Ungar, is a restoration ecologist and planner for the Army Corps of Engineers Buffalo District. He has over 15 years of experience in the environmental field, with positions held in the academic, private, nonprofit, and federal sectors. In his 10 years with the Corps, he has acted as a technical lead for ecological restoration projects addressing coastal, riparian, fluvial, wetland, and littoral systems. As part of this work, he is involved in the development and design of ecosystem and habitat restoration plans, oversight of project construction, and monitoring and adaptive management. He is currently working on developing measures that improve resiliency and ecological function of coastal systems, and beneficially using dredged material to create coastal wetland and aquatic habitat. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks, Molly, and thanks everyone. Happy to be part of this panel. Great to talk about plants. We can go to the next slide. So I work for the Army Corps of Engineers Buffalo District. Many people don't know one of the main missions of the Army Corps of Engineers is now ecosystem restoration. Has been for about 25 years. It's largely because the Corps did a lot of things that negatively impacted ecosystems. So it became a priority to try to work to restore some of those things. So out of the Buffalo District, I work primarily in coastal areas of Lake Erie and Lake Ontario. And I'm hoping today to share some of the lessons and hopefully provide some helpful advice on projects in plant establishment related to ecosystem restoration and other projects. So this slide here, I'm showing Seneca Bluffs, which is a natural habitat park in Buffalo. This site had big issues with erosion and invasive species. And part of our approach here was to try to find a way to balance the risks of erosion with the ecological outputs we were hoping to achieve, right? And the intent and the goals of our partner, which were to maintain a park that had walking trails that weren't getting eroded away and becoming a hazard. And so we were able to do that. We were able to establish an intact riparian floodplain, as well as improve in-river ecological habitat, but it took a couple years. And so one thing we learned was you really need to set out a clear establishment period. You're unlikely to plant, 1 year and walk away. It's going to take a couple years, and always double down on your seedings. You can get a lot of that can take you pretty far. Next slide, please. So lately with our ecosystem restoration projects, because they are interacting with the built environment in urban environments, we are trying to figure out ways to create infrastructure that provides ecological benefits as well as providing engineering and structural benefits, right? Do both things at once. We have a term for that. We call that engineering with nature and natural and nature-based features. So showing here is a site along the Buffalo River. On the top left, you can see what it was previously. It was dilapidated infrastructure. It was a concrete retaining wall along the shoreline. No real interconnection between the river and that riparian habitat. And we work to try to reestablish those different aquatic and floodplain vegetation zones. And an important part of this was setting out long-term invasive species treatment, understanding that establishing the plants would take multiple seasons. The water level on the Buffalo River is out of our control. And so actually this emergent zone here has been under about 2 feet more of water in the past 4 years than when we started the project. And so we had to really adapt. We had to change, and it really helped having multiple plantings because we could sort of adjust their species in our specific locations based on those environmental conditions that we couldn't control. Next slide, please. And lastly, something I'm sure everybody's heard, but monitoring and adaptive management really helps out. It helps us as institutions, as individual organizations and broader institutions and collaboratives figure things out, helps our projects to be more successful. And so you want to try to build that in. It's usually pretty, it can be a little difficult, but it doesn't need to be super detailed. It could be, the key is to tie it directly to the objectives of your project and figure out metrics that you can measure, like plant coverage or like certain species that you're targeting directly. And so you know whether the things you're doing, the plants you're establishing are doing so in a way that is meeting the objectives of your project. And with that, thanks everybody. I'm happy to be part of this panel. Looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Josh. Our next and last speaker, Mark, is a certified professional horticulturist with a decade of experience in a variety of landscape settings. He is skilled in the cultivation, installation, and maintenance of planting in public realm settings. He is also experienced with the incorporation of xeric water management and irrigation practices, integrated pest management, and other sustainable maintenance strategies to ensure long-term planting success. Mark has worked as a nursery production specialist in the US and abroad, and has worked as a design build technician for numerous public and private projects in New York and New Jersey. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Annie. As Annie, and thanks everybody for listening to what I have to say. As Annie said, before I was in landscape architecture, I've had a variety of experience in from working in a nursery to landscaping through to park maintenance. And I've been trying at SiteWorks. I've been using that experience to bridge the gap between the owners, the designers, and the maintainers when it comes to landscapes, and especially when it comes to landscapes that are new and something that a lot of people don't have a lot of experience in maintaining. Could you go to the next slide, please? I think the first part is to get started by planning for maintenance, and that really starts with at day one. It's very, very important to from the first day to kind of put that idea out there that maintenance needs to be planned for. A lot of owners just don't quite have a good understanding of all the different tasks it takes to maintain a garden. As you see on the left, this is a breakdown from a project where we kind of helped a park system define, to figure out like how they were spending their time and how they could improve maintenance through their park system. And what we found, it was they're doing a lot. They're doing a lot of work, and it can be quite complicated what goes into maintenance. And on the right, you see a maintenance manual that defines all the processes that need to happen in the Ford Foundation's atrium, which is a totally different type of landscape, but one that is difficult to maintain and Interior atriums aren't necessarily, commonplace in things that maintainers are skilled in maintaining. So that was so really both of these methods, maintenance and operations estimating and creation of maintenance manuals, are ways that the ideas of what needs to happen can be communicated to both the owner and the operator of the landscape, and also communicated to the people maintaining it. Can you go to the next slide, please, Annie? Another thing that needs to happen is to to plan for training, and through the maintenance and operations manuals, the design intent can be communicated, from the designer through to the people on the ground actually doing the maintenance work. At Ford Foundation, one of the things that had happened to the original Dan Kiley design is that the plants that were originally used and specified were not quite suitable for the space, as it was totally experimental at the time it was built originally. So because those plants didn't work out, and they had to be all changed out, over the years, the maintenance team had essentially completely altered the landscape, and it was restored recently in 2018. It was redesigned by Raymond Jungles, and that that design intent that was taken from the original Dan Kiley design. And one thing the manual does is it preserves it in the manual, and we've been working with the installers and the maintainer, which is Alpine Construction, to to communicate that intent, with them, to their staff on the ground, and to talk about what that means and how that impacts their maintenance. So whether it's focusing on, as you see on the left, keeping the space open, keeping the sight lines visible throughout, keeping the right textures of plants, and just making sure we communicate what the space needs to look like beyond just like keeping the plants healthy. A lot of times people doing plant maintenance, they know a lot about plants, and they're really focused on providing the optimal conditions for the plants to grow, but they need to also understand how that relates to the design intent. And they also really appreciate somebody's communicating with them about what's what the designer was trying to do, and what kind of forms, talking about like design, like, okay, this is a biomorphic space, and this is the kind of look we're going for. Can you go to the next slide, please, Annie? And I guess a third part of it is just working with the maintenance team on the technical aspects of maintaining a lot of these landscapes. This is a littoral zone, a tidal littoral zone that's at Roberto Clemente Park, and it's a really great to have this. This is in the Bronx, and it's a really great landscape. It gets inundated occasionally, or part of it does, by tidal action. And but it's also naturalistic planting. It's got a ton of native species in there, and these are species that while the maintenance team there is skilled and experienced in maintaining landscapes, lawns, perennial plantings, shrub plantings, and trees, they don't have a whole lot of experience, or they didn't have a whole lot of experience with maintaining a naturalistic planting full of native plants. They had no idea. They were just out there when we first went out for the training. They were out there like, what is this? Is this a plant? Is this a weed? What are we doing? And a big part of the training I did there was, talking with them about how to maintain these native plantings so they still look native, how to identify the plants that they're supposed to keep, and how to identify the problem invasives that they would have to combat. On the right, you see a big chunk of Phragmites root that as part of our training, the staff learned to identify the Phragmites and how to remove it so they could keep it out of the garden and keep the space maintained. And hopefully through these efforts, we can, I can kind of link the, and the idea, try to work towards, the ideal project where we can facilitate the communication from the top, the people conceiving the project, through to the designer and through to the people actually maintaining the project. And when all those three things really come together, you can have a really good execution of a beautiful landscape. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Now we're going into our questions roundtable. So everyone in the audience, if you had any questions, you can put it in the Q&A box and not in the chat. And I'm going to kick off our first question to Desiree.
All
There
right.
you are.
Yeah.
So Desiree, you recommended that landscape architects start the conversation of maintenance early on in the project. So ideally, what phase of the design or construction would you consider it early enough? And also, in your professional experience, have you been brought in as early as you had hoped?
There are multiple answers to this question. I think I'm gonna just kind of break it up piece by piece. When I say early on, I do mean as early as possible. I mean, from our perspective, ETM, we get in, could be as early as master plan phase or the SD phase. Typically, when that happens is because we want to be able to assess, the client's current capacity. We deal with a very wide range of clients that could, either be very well established city folks, nonprofit organization, or they're only starting. So, so oftentimes, I feel like all of my clients, their hearts are at the right place, but the reality is that they don't really always have the right funding. And so, or they have the right staff in place to know, can they take on the project? So we want to have this conversation early on, like I said, to assess what they have right now and what will they need in the future. I mean, it's a long planning process because oftentimes they don't really know what they want to do or what they need. And we just kind of work with them every step of the way. And also, as we know, the design between SD to CD can change dramatically. So we just want to be able to just kind of inform them every step of the way. Now, another piece to it is that, we have worked on some projects where we actually recommended them to hire their core staff. It could be the horticulture supervisor or the operations director, as early as, anywhere between 6 to 12 months before the park construction is completed. Because this way, one, it allows them to hire the staff that they need. And two, again, is to have that conversation with the designers. So this way, they're working with them hands in hands, like, know where the irrigation system is, what kind of irrigation system we're dealing with, water fountain, planting vision. If a tree comes down, do you remove it? Do you leave it on a nurse log? But if you fall too far onto the pathway, you might want to have it removed. There are a lot of things that you will have to work with the staff in order to help them, understand what it takes to maintain the park, again, to your vision, and also, the long-term goal your design is supposed to achieve. And the answer to your very last piece of that question is, there were times when we were not actually brought on as early as we would like, but we have noticed that, there are more and more projects that the clients are aware that we need to have this conversation early on. A bit of a more, I would say, extreme of an example is that we were brought on a project actually doing a CD phase because the client was interested in knowing, what is it going to cost us to maintain the park based on the CD design. Let's just say we actually ended up helping them bring the design back to DD. So there were just a number of things that they needed to work out. And part of it was, just kind of realizing that they might not actually have the budget and the staffing resources to allow them to maintain the park based on that design vision, and therefore, it's this kind of a bit of a negotiation between the design team and also the client to just be able to, allow the client to maintain the landscape the way the design team is designing. I mean, you don't want to hand over a design and say that, well, this is what I want. I don't care that you cannot maintain it, because that's not what we were trying to do. So, having that conversation as early as possible, it's vital to the longevity of your project.
Great. We have an interest. We've got a lot of questions coming in on our Q&A panel, so I think we'll jump to a couple of those. One of the questions is, have any of you ever used the Sustainable Sites Initiative rating systems, best practices for design, construction, and operation and maintenance? Have you ever been part of a site certified project team?
Yes, actually, we worked on Section 8 of the O&M manual for Canal Park down in Washington, D.C. That is a 3-star certified project. It definitely, really gets you thinking about a lot of, details that need to go into, what it takes to maintain the park. And in order to, trying to get it done right, it will cost you, like just using the right material, not using certain things, possibly, doing things more manually versus, just laying down a bunch of chemicals on planting. Not saying that, that if that's something that you should never do, because, there are certain situations where, a little bit more traditional pesticide may be needed. But, these are the things that you need to, think about, talk through, and just kind of realize what that impact is. And another one is that we're working on is actually the Waterloo Greenway project down in Austin, Texas. And that one's a little bit interesting in the sense that, like, there are invasive species actually along the waterway that only really respond to pesticides. So, I mean, we were trying to kind of juggle that with just the whole site things. Can you, how much of it can you do, and which one take precedence first? But it really just kind of get you thinking, because all you're really trying to do is to make sure that you are providing the best maintenance for your sites. But again, like I said, it does come with a price, and you just have to kind of, realize what that means.
Okay, another question that we have in the Q&A, what methods of invasive plant removal are best specified for a public landscape?
I could take a shot at that. I think it ultimately depends on what your objectives are there, in terms of, what type of methods can you actually use, right? So a lot of times the most reliable, do involve mechanical and chemical treatments, right? Those are also the most sort of straightforward, in that you can sort of say, if we apply this over this time period, we should have pretty good results. Some other methods, non-chemical methods, smothering, pulling, that could be a lot more intensive, using heavier equipment to get in there. That may depend on what type of public use that area is under, and whether or not, you can get large machinery, things with whirling blades in there, and if it's going to affect, the use of that park. So I think it really comes down to sort of what the goal is, and what you're willing to try out, and sort of what your tolerance is for uncertainty.
Anybody else want to add to that at all?
I can kind of piggyback on what Josh said. It really does depend on the situation. It depends greatly on what kind of invasive removal you're doing. A lot of times, if a public project is having, when it's constructed, it's going to go through a very intensive, especially if you're dealing with something like Phragmites, where you just have a solid mat of root, it's going to go through a very intensive invasive removal process. And that process would, typically involve the entire site being under construction and shut down. And what's really important is that after that, there's follow-up, because there's no way that that can possibly get 100% of your Phragmites out. And there's also going to be, pressure of it coming back into the site again. So it's important that the maintenance team be able to keep on it as part of their maintenance, to keep it under control, whatever that threshold that is decided that's desirable, to keep it under control, or to keep it in the spaces where it's allowed, so it doesn't start to take over the site again.
And just a quick, piggybacking off of what Mark just said, we worked on a project up in Toronto where they have a lot of Phragmite problems. And, we talked to the staff about it, and they said, it's a combination of two. They found that mechanical removal, which is basically ripping that entire piece of Phragmite up, works great. But the fact is that because Phragmite grows along the water, and they will get carried right back into the soils immediately. And so, there are times where, they might not be able to get a machine, or simply just don't have the manpower to go out there ripping it up. They might have to use, pesticides, herbicides and pesticides and various other things in order to get it out, or at least keep it under control. Like, you have to just kind of ask yourself, what is my threshold? And kind of just run with that. But I mean, it really depends on the situation, and it comes down to, how much manpower do you have, and how much money are you willing to put into it?
Great. Another similar, I guess, question. I'll direct it to Mark. So on the flip side of that, what are your recommendations for maintaining naturalistic planting?
I guess naturalistic planting is always a sticky word, because that is, subjective to what the project is and what people think of it is. So I mean, it could be anything from a managed meadow to like a more like a Pete Adolph design, where it looks naturalistic, but it's very much, a garden and quite high maintenance. So from an aesthetic perspective, you want to let plants grow to, their natural form. You don't want things to be like, you don't want your shrubs to be meatballs. You want them to grow to their natural form and size. That involves, planning on the part of the designer to allow things to grow to their full size and provide them with enough space to do so. The maintainers need to have a careful eye on the balance of the plantings. Typically, you're going to have some combination of grasses and forbs. So you need to make sure that no one plant ends up taking over. A lot of times you'll have something that's very aggressive in your mix. Often it's going to be Rudbeckia is a popular plant that's used, and they just seed everywhere, and they could probably take over a lot of naturalistic perennial gardens if allowed. So it's important that the maintainers have an understanding of, what the proportion of, all the plants, like how much of the garden is supposed to be each individual plant. So as the plants, move, they seed around, they self-propagate, that the intended balance of the garden is maintained. If you're dealing with a managed meadow, that's more about mowing. You don't want to go in there and edit, individual plants out. That would, kind of be contrary to the point of a landscape like that. Whereas if you're dealing with a naturalistic perennial planting, you would want to and need to understand that that's going to be part of your maintenance, is going in and you're expecting your gardeners to rebalance the planting to keep it having the look that you want.
Speaking of meadow maintenance, have any of you guys on the panel dealt with controlled burns to maintain wildflower meadows?
I've dealt with controlled burns to maintain nursery stock grown in the field, grass nursery stock grown in the field. It's quite good for weed control, but it's also dangerous, because you are, if you burn a large area of dry grass, you are sending up some pretty tall flames. It can be pretty impressive. So typically, I'd say it's where it can be applied is pretty limited because you have to have the safety capabilities to put out the fire should it get out of hand, and you really want to be far away from anything that could be damaged by it. You know, controlled burns are pretty good at weed control and, you know, burning up weed seeds if you have a lot of nuisance weeds. I don't know if I would really consider them, they don't touch the roots at all, so they're not really good at controlling anything that is, you know, that you need to take the roots out. And honestly, the effect of a controlled burn in most situations is very similar to the effect of mowing, which is much safer.
Yeah, just to add on to what Mark said, just second that. You know, we don't do a ton of that up here around Buffalo. It's difficult to be in an area where, you know, the local fire marshal, you know, is like, you know, is willing to be okay with it. But I have heard our sister district in Chicago, they've used that for some weed management. But it is as you know, Mark said, it's species dependent, right? Some species are going to do really well. It could be a really effective, efficient way to remove a lot of standing biomass. So if you have something like Phragmites or knotweed, where that standing biomass actually suppresses the native seed regeneration in the plants below it, and you need a good way to remove it, it could be super expensive to cut that, bag it up, and try to remove it off site. And so burning can be useful in certain places, but it isn't, and it's super exciting, right? But it is something that it's a little bit dangerous. It requires a specialized group of skills and requires being in an area where, that practice is acceptable, and you're not going to have people blowing their tops over it, right?
Worked on a couple of projects in Texas that had done controlled burn. Houston, being Houston, it's a big city. That it was actually the Houston Arboretum and Nature Center. They only got approved probably at this point a dozen years ago on a small parcel, about an acre, and they said it was a very difficult process. They would love to do it again, but the fire marshal would probably not allow them to do it. But I mean, it took them days and weeks of educating the public, making public service announcements, just trying to let people know that if you see smoke this day, don't panic, don't overload the system with just phone calls about the city's burning down. So that's one. They would love to do it, but it's very difficult to do it in cities. Another one actually has great success is it's in Austin, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. They have established a program they do burns a couple times a year. They've just kind of worked out a really great relationship with the local fire marshals, so that if you see smoke, their neighbor got used to it at this point, and so they won't be calling the cops. I think the biggest problem and the biggest hurdle to prescribe burn is that if you do it in an area, most people's first reaction is to call the police and call the fire department. And it's a long process to just kind of get people acclimated, understand why you are doing it, and that, and actually let them know what the benefits are. But it involves multiple agencies when you just want to try to set up a burn program.
Mm-hmm. Another question in the Q&A window. Do you find plant size matters with establishment, and what are your recommendations for plant sizes?
My recommendation is, I found that the difference between a quart size and a gallon size plant for establishment to be really insignificant, and often plants are better at adapting to their particular environment they're put in the younger they are. So the younger plant, it's actually, I know we usually have people pushing, the clients want the instant landscape look, and they want the most mature plants as possible put in so they can have their garden installed on day one. But actually, paradoxically, the smaller you can start, the healthier, the faster your plants will grow, and the healthier and better adapted to their environment they will be.
And another part to that is that if you put in a much larger plant and it dies, that's going to cost a whole lot more money to remove. And so, usually when you deal with larger plants that you're installing on day one, like Mark said, they actually don't actually adapt very well. They tend to grow much, much, much slower. And you actually will require a significant amount of maintenance right off the bat to just make sure that these plants do well, because they're not going to show stress until much later on. And so by the time that you really start deteriorating, you're looking at probably getting a lot of equipment onto the site in order to remove a 9-inch caliber tree. So you got that look for the first few years, and then after that, you got a mess in your head. Not saying that you cannot do it, but it's just kind of coming to that realization that you are going to have to put in that effort.
Yeah. And I just add to that one other thing, just to echo what both Mark and Desiree said, is consider your site conditions. Specifically, what sort of nuisance pests might you have there, right? It may be a target of what you're trying to restore, maybe something you're trying to restore for, like beaver, if you're trying to build functional habitat, or maybe it's an area is going to be under deer browse. That can affect the type of species. Obviously, if you go with a large tree and you don't protect it right, the beaver's going to take it right down, and you're gonna be out. And deer by the same way. If you have a site that's mostly under deer browse, you might be better off going out for something larger, because then the crown is above their browse area, and as long as you don't have a buck scraping it, you might be able to get by that. And if you got both, you may just need to protect, and that's about all you can do. But it should be a consideration into sizing your plants.
I have
I wanted to ask,
go
sorry. Ahead, Molly.
More specific question on that, because Desiree, you're talking about like 9-inch caliper trees, but there's actually been a conversation lately I've been having about, something as small as, say, one of the cities I work for requires 2.5 to 3-inch caliper trees, whereas the New York State DOT came back and says, well, we usually use 1.5 to 2-inch. So, that's a lot more specific than 2-inch versus 9-inch. Do people have any specific feelings about something as small as, if we're talking about a park or a streetscape, whether it's better to go with 1.5 to 2 or 2.5 to 3?
Well, streetscapes, often you have to be able to limb up your tree to about 7 feet to install it. So that's really a controlling factor there. You can't go too small, or you won't have any tree left.
Yeah, I think it's mostly kind of the city standards. As Mark mentioned earlier, sometimes the smaller trees do fare better. That the typical size I see for a lot of the city projects, I would say, is probably 2.5. I've worked on a project recently where they said, kind of the 2-inch was the sweet spot for them, where, if it's anything smaller, it's easier to get damage. In their case, it's actually damage through vandalism. People tend to just kind of be able to snap it, break it, and then but above 2-inch, and then of course the price goes up exponentially if you're kind of looking at 3-inch plus. So for them, for their purpose, because they are planting street trees most of the time to increase the urban tree canopy, they found that the 2-inch, 2.5-inch was their sweet spot. But the 9-inch is a really unusual situation.
Yeah.
But I have definitely ran into a number of projects where it's anywhere between 6 to 9 inches.
So we've got another question here. What is your position on planting groupings of the same species as opposed to a lot of different species together?
I could say something about that. We've tried both. Usually we're planting, several acres of area. So we've tried planting groups of the same species together really, really densely, as well as planting different species together. And we haven't seen a big difference, so that's just anecdotal. But what we've been trying to do more of now is so if we have a large area, like 10 acres, right? Rather than try to put even spacing of plants, 2 feet. And mostly what I'm thinking of is like smaller plants, emergence, herbaceous plants, rather than spacing them even, 1 to 2 feet across that area, to actually cluster them into, sometimes the term used is called founder colonies, right? And the benefit of that is, so you start in each, over like maybe a 3-year time period, each year you add more colonies. And so in those colonies, you may cluster them much tighter than, 2-foot spacing, a variety of species, right? Outside of the colonies, you're not really installing plugs, you're just maybe seeding, and then the colonies are widely spaced out. And the objective there is it's more efficient, you're putting out less plugs, which are more expensive. And then after the first year or two, those species start putting out their own propagules. So you start covering up species. So that's kind of diverted from the how close to cluster plants and same species, but that our concept of founder colonies is seeming to work for us and help us to be more efficient with our planting of large areas.
We've got a question here about specifications, which is one of our objectives that I don't think we've really covered too much yet. What are some of the typical shortcomings you see in a typical landscape architect's planting specifications? Or what have you changed in your specifications based on your experience?
I could jump in with something to get us started, sort of maybe tangentially address the question. One thing that's a big challenge for us in specs is plant warranties, right? And this has to do with if maybe you're doing something that's more of, a natural design in a system that's not really managed, it isn't really a controlled system. So something next to a river that, that is under the effects of pests and water level fluctuations and storms. Typical specs that you might normally ask for when you can control the situation is like 1 year, right? We want this plant material to last 1 year. And that's hard in the natural setting because you kind of get in these discussions with your contractor. Well, it died. And he said, well, you shouldn't have planted in 2 feet of water. Well, that's what we're trying to get it established. It just needs another year. So that could be a real challenge in your specs. And what I've started doing is really, the purpose of that is to focus on, you want to make sure that plug was installed. Sometimes we're willing to take the risk that it's not the ideal planting situation, but we're trying to establish that community at that location because we know over the long term it's most likely to establish well there. And so I focus more on the planting season. We want to see that it's well established and it tolerates the planting season. And if the next year comes along and ice flows or other things kind of take it out, we accept that and we try to do replantings. But that's a challenge, warranties.
And just kind of going off about the warranty is that, in our experiences that, when you put the warranty on the contractor, the problem is they're not on site all the time to actually know what is going on. In our experience, we're really just trying to get the client on board way early on. Yes, there is a warranty, but the thing is, the way how the contractor function is that they might come in once every blue moon, check that it's still barely alive, it's fine, and then it's the clock start counting down, and if it's not dead, great. If it's dead, they replace it and they walk away because you just met that 1 year warranty. And so now, you got, if you don't have your maintenance staff in early on, now they kind of left with this dealing with the issues because, why did this plant die? Is there a reason behind it? Is it the soils? Is it the water? Is it maybe just simply not the right plant and you really need to be using a different species that's doing much better 2 foot away? So when you do put in the same plant back in there, it's not resolving the problem. 6 months down the road, you're still going to have that problem. So I would say, there's really not an exactly right answer to that. But the way how we will advocate is that even if there's a plant warranty written in the specification, sometimes it can be pretty hard to just kind of hold the contractor to it. And that you really should still have someone there to actually know the plant, know your landscape, and know what is going on.
Yes, I totally agree. The plant warranty does not guarantee that you're going to get, good maintenance for the warranty period. It is a really easy way out for a contractor to come on like the last week and just replace everything that died and say, okay, see you later. And that's something that's really difficult to combat with your specifications. Another thing that's a potential opportunity would be to, try to especially if you're doing a type of landscape that's not a standard maintenance practice, or maybe the organization's maintenance team isn't familiar with, but the landscape contractor who installed it is familiar with the establishment and maintenance of a managed meadow or a littoral zone, would be to, create a training relationship between them. So you could have your contractor and your maintenance team, working together for a bit. So there's a passing of the torch as a part of your established landscape establishment.
And we might have time for one last question, I think, 506. So when is a monitoring plan necessary, and what constitutes as a good monitoring plan? I'll just ask the group as a whole.
Sure. What I'd say is, it's always good to consider monitoring, right? It doesn't need to be totally exhaustive. And what makes a good monitoring plan, I think, is if it connects to your objectives of your project, right? You don't need to measure everything. You don't, more data is good, but sometimes it's also confounding, right? And so really try to tie it to what your objectives are. And if your objectives are to establish, a diverse wet meadow mix in a given area, well, with the specifics of less than 5% invasive species and more than 90% cover. Well, that's something you can pretty easily go out and measure and confirm you've got that success. And the process of doing that monitoring informs you. It informs necessary adaptive management measures, and it's good institutional information that you can apply to future projects.
Well, this has been a very interesting discussion, but unfortunately our time is up this evening. We've got some online resources to share. Josh wanted to share the Army Corps Technical Guide to Ecosystem Adaptive Management. So the link is up there, or you could just Google it too. And there's a couple links there from our previous panel discussions that help you determine what plants are native in your region, and some information about plant communities, which we talked about in some of our other panels. I'll leave the slide up for a minute while I thank our sponsors, Parkitex, Victor Stanley, and Ernst Seeds. I'd also like to offer special thanks to both the New York Upstate and New York chapters of ASLA for collaborating on this series, and to our team who put this particular session together: Annie Passawad, Molly Vendura, Tom Klein, Diane Katz, and Steve Lawson. We have a quiz and an evaluation. So if you want credit for this session, I did put the links to the quiz and the evaluation in the chat screen, so you can copy those out and paste them into your browser. You might want to do that before you start filling them out, just so you can get those links copied and in your possession before we shut down for the night. These are the links here, but as I said, they're also in the chat. And other than that, thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you who tuned in tonight, and have a great evening. Hope you found this helpful.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great evening.
Have a good night.